been more than 20 years since I began working with bonsai. In the early days, as with most of us, I had more questions than I had answers. But bonsai became an overriding passion for me. It became my reason for getting up in the mornings. As time began to pass, I began to get invitations to travel, and I've been to all sorts of interesting places and met all sorts of interesting people around the world. In the later years, we've been developing a successful bonsai business, and that's generated masses and masses of correspondence. In all of those years, of all of that correspondence, of all of those emails, all of the phone calls and the hundreds of people that I've spoken to, there's one overriding question that seems to bear on people's minds, and it's got to the point where I'm so frustrated with answering the question, I've decided to do a YouTube movie exclusively dedicated to the subject. So, what is the question? How long do you leave the wire on a tree? Seriously? Seriously, how long do you leave the wire on a tree? Without wishing to be patronising or appear to be a complete arsehole, I decided it was time that we dealt with this question. The second answer is the wire should stay on the tree as long as is possible, as long as it's not doing any damage. So many of you will remember this tree from about a year ago. We posted this onto YouTube. At that time the tree was fully wired. Now we've got to the point where we need to begin to remove some of the wire, so I'm just going to show you that, to show you the principles so that you will understand how long the wire needs to stay on the tree, and hopefully this will answer everybody's questions. Here you can see some thick wires that were laid on this branch just over a year ago. This branch hasn't fattened at all at this point. The wires aren't digging in, they're not marking the tree in any way, so these wires can stay put. Here we can see two separate wires. This one is fine, this is not digging in, the branch is not starting to thicken at all. This one, on the other hand, the branch has started to thicken, the wire is just starting to mark the branches, so that can be removed. The point of wiring is to shape branches. That process happens by basically applying the wire to the branch, bending the branch, and then allowing the branch to generate new sapwood in the new position. The new sapwood obviously grows to suit the position that we've put the branch into. So the longer we can leave the wire, the more sapwood will generate underneath the bark. That means the branch will have more resistance to springing back to its original position. Now obviously there's a point at which so much sapwood is produced that the branch begins to swell and the wire starts to dig into the branch. That's the point at which we need to remove the wire. The time is immaterial. It depends on the growth of the tree. For instance, lower branches don't usually grow or fatten as much as higher parts of the tree. So as a consequence, we may be removing the wire in the top of the tree a long time before we remove the wire in the lower parts. The secret is to watch the branches very carefully, and as soon as they appear to be pinching in any way, then we remove the wire. If we leave the wire too long, on some trees like say pines and larch where the bark is very thick, it's not a problem because any wire marking will very quickly grow out. But on other particularly deciduous trees and thin bark species, it's important that we get the wire off as soon as we possibly can after the branches will have fixed in position, because if we leave them too long we'll scar the bark, and potentially that scarring will be there pretty much for the rest of the life of that tree as bonsai. Removing wire is something that relies on careful observation of the tree. You very often find that the thicker branches don't set in position so quickly, but because they support more foliage, they fatten more rapidly, so the wire needs to come off sooner. Conversely, on some species you find that the thick branches set very quickly and the thinner branches don't set so quickly. So in that case you may have to leave it longer one way or another. It really depends on the individual tree, and that's why I'm not going to give you a straight answer to the question, how long does the wire stay on the tree? The tools required for removing wire from bonsai are exactly the same as the tools required for applying wire to bonsai. We need a pair of pliers and we need a pair of wire cutters. Now when it comes to wire cutters and removing wire, it's really important that we have a good quality pair of wire cutters. The simple reason being, if we take something like this cheap pair of wire cutters, and if I put that wire into there and cut that, you'll see the end of that wire begins to fold upwards before it shears off. And the problem with that is, if we have a wire that's wrapped around a branch and the branch has begun to thicken, as we begin to cut the wire, the tendency of the wire cutter to fold the wire will move it sideways, and that can potentially cause all sorts of problems in removing bark from around the wire and cause all sorts of problems and damage to the tree. So a good pair of wire cutters is really important. But there are two basic types. There is a shear type, and in a shear type of wire cutters the blades actually pass each other. They're very good for small diameter wires and getting into very awkward places. For heavier wire we need something like this, and this wire cutter has two opposing blades, and you can see they just butt up to each other, they don't actually pass. And finally we need a good quality pair of wiring pliers. These ones, I don't know if they're wire pliers or gym pliers, but they have a very fine point, and they have an angled head which enables me to get into all sorts of inaccessible places, because on occasions I may need to get in and pull the end of a wire upwards away from the branch so that I can cut it cleanly. Wire cutters are particularly dependent on the pivot to make sure that the cutting edges stay aligned, because it's no good if the cutting edges are wobbling like this. And also with this type of wire cutter, if they don't meet up, the tendency is as you cut the wire it doesn't quite bite through, so it doesn't shear off. And right at the end, once you've closed the handles of the wire cutter, the natural tendency is, and you do this almost without thinking, is to give it a little twist. And as you give it a twist, it'll obviously break that tiny remaining wire material that's in between the cutting edges. But as you do, again, you will twist the wire on the branch this way, and that runs the risk of damaging the bark even further. So the basic idea is that we need to get the wire off as quickly as possible with the least amount of damage and stress on the tree. The next thing we need to do before we start removing wire is to actually cover the soil surface. This is something that's important and I very rarely see done. The reason for this is wire is generally copper or aluminium, both of which will corrode on the surface in contact with water and oxygen, and produce with copper, obviously copper oxide, or with aluminium oxide. Both are detrimental to the health of the tree. And if you've got an open structured soil mix, all sorts of small pieces of wire will get in there, and so rather than run the risk of causing some problems to the roots, it's best to just cover this, and then that will catch all the wire as it comes out of the tree. So when it comes to removing wire from the tree, just part the branches lightly, take your wire cutter and cut at exactly a 90-degree angle to the direction of the wire. If you cut at an angle, the wire cutters will invariably twist the wire, and that can cause some damage. So you just go in and you take a bite like so. Once you've cut that twice, you can just take that coil away, and you can just go through the whole tree, just removing that piecemeal, just little by little. I know a lot of people like the idea of unravelling the wire, but that's time consuming. It can cause all sorts of damage to the tree as well, and the wire that you remove is absolutely worthless and no use for anything. So don't be a cheapskate, just prune the wire away. This causes the least amount of stress on the tree, and it gets the work done quickly and cleanly. And as you go along, just remove all the little cut pieces and let those fall out underneath. I've now finished removing the wire from this area, and as you can see, it's just about evidence of where the wire has been, but it's not dug in so deeply that it's caused any permanent damage. It's the middle of summer here, this tree is growing very quickly, and these marks will disappear within a week or two. In this branch here you can see the wires perhaps pinched in a little bit more than we would like, and so rather than trying to get a wire cutter in there and trying to dig in there and cut that wire, what we do is just use the wire pliers, and just in the exact same direction of rotation of the wire, we take the end and we just bend that very carefully, and as we come round, that wire lifts up. Once we get a coil out, we can then prune the tail end away, and then using the pliers again, we come back in and we can remove that round to the next coil, and you can see that just begins to lift, and that's just enough to be able to get the wire cutters into there and prune that away. Then we can go in and same again. All the time we need to support the branch and be careful that we don't bend it more than we have to. Prune that away, and then with the pliers around the next one. This is a very good technique for removing wire that's just beginning to pinch, perhaps a little bit more than we would like. And there you can see this wire has caused some damage on this branch, but bearing in mind that this branch is nearly doubled in thickness in a year, within another year these wire marks will almost entirely disappear. And since this is not bonsai, it's only a tree in development, it's going to be several years before this tree goes on to exhibition. In that time these marks are going to completely disappear. But one of the significant things you can see here is that this wire is removed and this branch has stayed exactly in the position that it was placed over a year ago. No finish removing the wire from this juniper, and as it turned out it was okay to remove everything. As you can see, the branches have all stayed more or less in the position that we placed them originally, so that means the wire's done its work. Some of the definition has been lost, but at this stage in this tree's development that's fine. What will now happen is, for the next 2 years at least, this tree will be pruned, the foliage pads will be tightened up, we'll increase the twig density and ramification, and then maybe 2, maybe 3 years time we'll be able to go through and do some refinement wiring on this tree, and that will involve just placing the ends. The primary branches are all more or less fixed in the position that we need them to be in. So hopefully this demonstration has shown you the progression of the wiring technique, and hopefully once and for all has settled the question, how long do you leave the wire on the tree?